when we play games, we're used to be able to see the hit points of all the enemies. We like having feedback, and that's the general advice people give when it comes to game design and how to design your own enemies. However, there's many games that completely hide the enemy hit points and even the boss hit points. And in fact, they can do so at great effect. So today we're taking a look at 3 reasons, plus one bonus one in the end, why even though it's common practice to show enemy and boss hit points, some games choose to hide it. So let's jump in straight away with reason number 1, which is to create a sense of mystery. So if you see the enemy and you directly know how many hit points the enemy has, then that sort of makes everything clear. And in the last video, we talked about the relationship between the player's hit points and the enemies and how that tells a story. If you didn't watch that, the gist of it is that if the player has 10 hit points and he sees an enemy with 100 hit points, if no other information is known, then the player assumes that that enemy is 10 times stronger than the player. So if you have those numbers, those two numbers, you can make that inference. But if you don't, if you just see a monster in front of you with no hit point bar or anything else, then you simply don't know how strong it is. Maybe it's a little stronger, maybe it's vastly stronger than you, or maybe it's weaker. Who knows? So when you want to create that sense of mystery, hiding the hit points is one of the things you can do. And if you don't have the hit points on an enemy, all you have to go with for inferring the enemy's strength is appearance. So if your character is a normal looking human and you see this monster with 5 heads and 30,000 tentacles, you get the feeling that it's stronger than you. Anyway, moving on. The second one is simplicity. So it's not that all games hide hit points to make things mysterious. In some games, it's just easier not to show them. For example, if you're playing an arcade-style game with lots and lots of enemies on the screen, having numbers and bars and feedback for each one of them is kind of a waste. It's kind of sensory overload, especially if those enemies will die very quickly in the game. So if these enemies, let's say there's 20 enemies on the screen and they all take 1 or 2 hits from your weapons or your missiles or your bullets or whatever to die, then meticulously tracking the hit points of every enemy makes no sense, because the enemy will be dead before you get a chance to even read the enemy's hit points, because usually there's a lot going on the screen. So basically this just wants to tell the player, look, don't worry about the individual hit points of an enemy. Focus more on defeating all of them, essentially. That's more important than tracking the enemy's hit points. There, the sense of progress is made by the enemies being defeated directly on the screen, rather than you having to track their values of hit points to track your own progress. And that brings us to number 3, which is letting the player focus on something else. So perhaps you have played in the past something in the Monster Hunter series, especially the earlier titles, or in Dark Souls or Souls-like games, or similar games, not necessarily those series, where bosses are so difficult and they take so much effort to defeat that it's not a 1-minute process. It's not something that will die in 1 or 2 hits. These bosses are supposed to be extended fights with multiple phases and clever tactics and all that stuff. So particularly, I want you to think about the process of seeing the monster, anticipating that it will make an attack, the player knowing that, of course, the attack is too powerful to take head on, so you have to dodge it, and then in the space between the monster's current attack that you just dodged and the next one, maybe there is a small opportunity to attack a little bit. If you don't master this sequence in those games, essentially you cannot make progress. There is no version of that battle where you can simply keep taking damage and keep dealing damage to the enemy. The enemy deals so much more damage that you'll be dead essentially before you get to make your next attempt. So in that kind of scenario, that sort of very martial, tempo-based, dodge-based combat, these prolonged fights that are usually 5, 10, 20 minutes long or even longer. The enemy hit points are not important, not nearly as important as mastering the dodge and counterattack dynamic. Once you master it, then you get this feeling that essentially it's kind of like learning a martial art, right? If you do everything right, then there's no way you can lose, sort of feeling. So in that situation, showing that the monster has 10,000 hit points at the beginning, and then you dropped it down to 9,200, and now it's at 9,075, it's meaningless. Taking time to look at the enemy hit points is a detriment. It makes you focus less on the core thing you should be executing, and you should be enjoying, actually, which is observe the monster, try to read the next move, try to read as quickly as possible what that next move is going to be, and how much of a window between its attacks you have to make your own attack, and what you should make that attack. So games like that rely on this loop so heavily that other information are a distraction, essentially. So in that situation, mastery is the reason why hit points are hidden. Mastering that loop is more important than essentially seeing your progress, knowing whether the monster is down at 70% or 50% or whatever, especially when these monsters or these bosses have moves that restore their own hit points, right? So if you spend time observing the hit points and thinking, am I doing well or am I losing or what? Then perhaps your attack is going to let the monster have enough time to go away and recover, or run away from you a little bit and start licking its wounds or drinking its potions and whatever. And that's exactly the moment when you shouldn't be distracted by anything else, and you should be taking advantage of this extended attack opportunity to hopefully stop that animation or deal more damage than it gets to recover, and so on. So mastery is very important for this. Of course, the downside of this is that if you're not used to this kind of dynamic, it might feel a bit hopeless and so on. But I don't know how those games feel for players, but if you're developing your own game, then this is an opportunity essentially to teach the player that since this loop is so important, it's important to learn it with easier enemies first. So you don't want to go from one hit kill small monsters to the full 50-minute boss fight. In my experience, if there is a tutorial stage in between to show the loop to the player in a safer, easier, faster paced environment, then that takes care of the hopelessness issue in gameplay. But that's another topic, so let me know if that's something you would like me to talk about. And finally, let's talk about the padding issue that also exists in video games. So I learned about this when I was working at Tri-Ace, which is a Japanese game company. And other places as well, but that was the main one. So I got to talk to many game developers that have made a lot of the traditional RPGs that we've seen coming out of Japan. So either they had worked in such a game before, the people that were working there, or that that's something we were doing in the game we were developing in that company. But anyway, the idea here is that, especially in RPGs, the classic Japanese ones, there's a lot of mystery around parameters and around hit point values and attack values and attack calculations and so on. So for example, let's say you have in a typical Japanese RPG, you get the fireball ability, or you get a fire sword special skill or something. That's all the information you have. Maybe there's a description that says deals fire damage. But what does that mean exactly? Does that mean that fire damage is more than your normal damage, or that you do normal damage and fire damage, or should you be using fire damage instead of your normal damage? And like when you meet a fox in the forest, will that fox enemy take more damage from fire or less or what? So there's all these questions that the player immediately makes in their head in milliseconds, essentially, when they see this new ability. And it becomes even more complex when there's many types of enemies in the game, some that clearly look wooden or organic or robots or elementals and so on. So you think, is fire good against water enemies, or does the water quench out the fire? So there's a lot of uncertainty here. And when I spoke to the people that made some of the most iconic stuff we've seen in the games industry, I suppose, the answer was like, why did you guys obscure these values so much, and why don't you just teach the player the damage formula and so on? The answer was simply, well, we have no other choice. And I thought, and I said, what do you mean? Why? There's plenty of choices. You could just show the formula. They said, no, obviously we can't do that, because if we show the formula, then the players can figure it out. I'm like, yes, that's the point. That's the benefit. It's not a downside. They're like, no, it's a downside, because if the player figures out the exact way to maximize his damage, then he's never going to use anything else. He's never going to experiment with abilities. He's never going to try different builds out. He's never going to want to explore. He will do the math and essentially know which ability is the best, or which combination of attacks and weapons and so on is the best. So he would never bother with basically 90% of the game's content. He would just choose the best one and go with that. And I thought, well, yes, but a player who does that, first of all, not all people will do this. And we know this from games that clearly state how much damage things do and so on. Yes, you could sit down and mathematically calculate the theoretical values of all attacks, but that's a bit of a bother. So yeah, some people are going to do that, but most people will just play and use these abilities at least once because they look cool, right? So it's not necessarily that people will ignore all the rest of the game. And then the answer to that was, well, yeah, that's true, but we have basically a minimum quota to get through when it comes to gameplay time. So when people purchase a game, they're looking at a minimum of, 10 hours or 30 hours or 50 hours of gameplay or something. So if we were to expose everything and say, you get 10 abilities, but clearly this is the best one, so don't bother with the rest, then people would just use that and finish the game in, a tenth of the time or something. So because they finished the game so quickly, that would leave them with the negative feeling that, they didn't get a good return on their investment, the investment being the price of the game, paying for the game. So in that case, extending gameplay is the purpose of hiding not just hit points, but much, much more. So you could clearly show the hit points of enemies in these games, but it's usually a mystery. And you do an attack and you get some damage, or you get no damage at all, and it leaves you wondering, and it leaves you basically with the only option being exploring more, experimenting more, trying different abilities, trying different weapons, and so on, and see what works. So whether that's a good thing or not, I will leave that up to you. What's out there is already out there, but if you enjoy it, that's great. If you don't enjoy it, well, now at least you're in a position to make your own games and your own choices about this one. Anyway, that's it for me for today. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, have fun.